Again, so please settle in.
Hi. I'm Gina Thomas from the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And I've been working primarily, initially with Dr. Randall Whitaker, who works for Northrop Grumman, in trying to develop what we're affectionately terming knowledge glyphs. Recently, I've started working with Geoff Barbier, who is in Arizona at the Air Force Research Laboratory in Mesa, and in the training division. And he's giving us now a nice test bed to try and develop and demonstrate some of this knowledge glyph technology, which is in its very, very infancy. So I don't want you to expect these big fancy pictures because we haven't really actually designed these things yet. Randy, oh, it actually does work. Randy Whitaker and I have worked together a lot in what our branch affectionately terms work-centered support systems, and doing designs for users. Primarily, we've been working for the Tactical Air Command Center at Scott Air Force Base, and basically doing some sorts of timeline designs and some other scheduling designs and resource selection tools for them to use. And what we do in that case, and I think, well, here we go. We actually use this work-centered approach, which basically we try to use like a first-person perspective, or learn as much as we can about the work and as much as we can about what the users need in information in order to present information in a timely manner. We don't do much automation. We mostly focus on trying to give users what they need at a time when they need it. This knowledge glyph theory, well, I'll just skip that. This knowledge glyph has focused in on more of a command and control environment, where now we have people looking at command centers using MIL standard 2525, which is a very archaic set of symbology. And so what we're trying to do is advance this visualization using some of the work-centered practices and theory to develop this new symbology set to try and accommodate modern warfare that's not accommodated so much by the current symbology. And we do this because we need to integrate the commander's intent to facilitate the use of maps and the kind of products, and to also integrate them with other things like Lorraine was talking about, where we had, where we now have to look into cyberspace and cyber maps. We have to look into other contexts, time context, as well as geo context. So what we're trying to do, excuse me, I'm just getting over a sinus thing, is to demonstrate, eventually we'd like to demonstrate a set of glyphs for a particular operational domain, and we're just kind of starting that phase of things. But we also have a lot of basic research that we need help on. Research about how you switch between contexts, and how effective the things that the models that we've developed for designing these knowledge glyphs, how effective they might be as opposed to other technologies. And we also need to continually look at other technologies and what other people are doing in order to keep, so that we don't just head down one track and get stuck there. We want to make sure that we're using the best thing, not just something because that's what we came up with. Okay. These little buttons are not happy for me. There we go. Again, where we kind of started is with this MIL standard 2525B, and MIL standard 2525B is a nice, pretty rich set of symbology, but one problem with it is it doesn't afford a lot of capacity for being able to deeply look into the entities of the battle space. It well represents things. It's a sort of a Napoleonic era. It was developed from sort of that Napoleonic era wartime. And so, but it really doesn't let you analyze things like what is the uncertainty about the pieces, what are the capabilities of the pieces. To some extent it does, but and then if you want to switch, if you're maybe at one point interested, you have a tank and you're interested in, maybe at one point you want to know how much fuel that tank has, at some other point you might want to be more interested in how much weaponry that tank has. It doesn't really give you a good way to augment that symbology for certain things. What it does is it basically gives you a really good look at the state of a battle space. Now the other issue is that it doesn't give you, what it also doesn't do is it also doesn't go much beyond this geo view. So most of what the military has done in the past has been based on sort of a standard warfare kind of a paradigm. So basically, everything is based on geomaps. And again, as Lorraine has mentioned, we're a lot more concerned now with cyberspace and information warfare. We're also concerned with other kinds of non-conventional warfare that aren't well depicted. Although they might be able to be depicted geographically, they're still not well depicted by your standard military, force-on-force kind of imagery. It worked that time. So what we want to do is we want to invent visualizations that exploit all of the data that pertains to a particular battle space entity, and we want to be able to examine that entity in terms of its role and implications across a variety of contexts. So not just necessarily in geospace. And why do we want to do that? Because we want to allow people that are doing command and control to see have a broader knowledge of the battle space. We want them to be able to look and do better prediction of a future state of a battle space not necessarily now being a piece of land. And we want to also be able to let the user continue to be focused on a particular object of concern. And some of the things that we've done in the past, some of the things that we've looked at in the past are to do things like overlaying sort of blobs to represent uncertainty about predicted movements or some kind of range of possible movements. We've looked at composite iconography that might allow, where we could take some standard symbol and say, okay, well, in this case of this was an apple. I know it looks more like a cherry. But doing things like taking some kind of standard, something that's really familiar to people, and we did some research to look into, well, what if you take that and, maybe like as the information ages, if you're using this symbol to represent, this is a particular piece of information, and then maybe let the apple kind of rot away as that information ages and deteriorates, and seeing how effective something like that is. We've looked at sort of 3D iconography, where maybe you could take some kind of cube and rotate it and be able to look at different dimensions of a problem based on, presenting this one symbol that represents some particular entity. And so we want to use some of this stuff to, display not only particular information about an entity, but also meta information about that entity, which we are defining as, information about information. So now you have an entity, you might know that it has, or you're reasonably sure that it has this much military capability, but now maybe what's the probability that it has that much, how sure are you? So we look at things like uncertainty, recency of data, those sorts of meta information types. And we also want to be able to portray those using some sort of iconography or some sort of visualization on a map. Oh, I messed with this last night, by the way, and rearranged some things, and I'm going to blame the computer for the entirety of it, because obviously I couldn't have screwed it up this bad, but I'll be skipping through some things because there's some things that I moved and thought I deleted one place, and I'm sure I didn't. But anyway, so, yeah, that's one of them. So here's what we want to tell you are the features of a knowledge glyph. A knowledge glyph is a type of a glyph, and a glyph we're defining as something sort of beyond a simple entity, denoting a simple entity, that can also allow you access to deeper information. We want to portray a knowledge glyph as a sort of a super icon so that it can, present things in different arrangements, and as a micro interface so that whatever information you have access to from this particular icon or glyph, you have some means that's directly visible means of accessing additional information. And we want to know that we want this knowledge glyph to be able to interrelate referential contexts. And this is the big thing that, the big part of the model that makes us say, okay, well now we're going to call it a knowledge glyph, because now it's going to maintain, we're going to do something where it's going to maintain the focus of the entity and rotate context in and out, rather than putting an entity here and then showing it in a different context somewhere else. So this is our framework. Again, we're calling an icon sort of just some element that just denotes some entity and specifies where it is in whatever context space we're looking at. A glyph having that additional ability to afford the user some way to look at extra information. And a knowledge glyph then allowing you to shift contexts in and out. So the prospective benefits of being able to do this is to allow us to use this particular model. In developing this model allows us to sort of telescope in and out. So now you can have an icon or you can have a knowledge glyph, and we want to be able to say, okay, well this thing can have these abilities, but we can also suck it in a little bit and make it into, a glyph, and then suck that in again and make it into an icon, so that we can telescope in and out and show the user only what he needs to see in terms of how rich this iconography needs to be at any given time. And it also opens up the perspective of being able to shift between contexts, or the ability to be able to shift between contexts without losing user focus on some particular item of interest. And I know this all sounds very general and theoretical, and that's because this is sort of the stage we're in. This is all we've managed to do, is come up with this model. And we've done some background research on it, which is these funded icon studies where we've looked at things like this little Apple presentation. We've also looked at some military, at the Mill Standard iconography, and looked basically what that iconography does. It just has a set of symbols and you put them together in different ways. And so you can have a lot of dimensions. You can actually have quite a lot of information on one icon. And we've looked at putting, at how many dimensions it's reasonable to expect a user to get out of those, that symbology, which dimensions are more salient than other dimensions on that iconography. Like there's, I don't have a nice picture of it here, but there are certain sort of standard ways that you put these symbols together, and by doing that, and you can adding information to it, so you could have a little number on there that maybe tells you how many are in this particular battalion or whatever, and you can have a symbol that looks sort of like a mushroom cloud. That's a nuclear symbol, and then if you turn that upside down, it looks kind of like a beaker, and that's a chemical symbol, and you can put all of those things on one icon. But we've done some AFOSR funded research, which is the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, that's looked at like, well, how many of those things can you reasonably expect people to gain when you start putting together icons in that way. And we're looking at doing some current research on the effects of backgrounds in maps, being able to characterize maps, being able to look at one of the ones that the upcoming thing that we want to look at is contextual effects. So we've said, okay, well, this is a big advantage, being able to, or we think this should be a big advantage, to be able to switch contexts rather than displaying some entity on in more than one context in two separate places, but we haven't really done research to back that up. So that's some of the research that we're looking into doing. Oh, now I'll let you push it. I just must push them better sometimes than others. Or the thing's just stuck. So our sort of next moves are to move from this basic research into demonstrating a glyph set, using this glyph set to do some more kind of basic research and some more applied research. We're in the process of doing that. We need to look at a particular operational area, develop a glyph set, because we think that a knowledge glyph isn't necessarily it's not like a knowledge glyph is a knowledge glyph. Maybe we want to use some that are based on the mill standard symbology. Maybe in some other context, like a medical context, a medical field, they might have their own set of symbology that we might want to grow into what we want to call knowledge glyphs. So we want to look at different areas where we might be able to develop knowledge glyph sets. And so we want to eventually target this into some operational area for command and control. But in the meantime, doesn't necessarily mean that our first symbology set will be a mill standard set or in the area of command and control. And where Jeff Barbier comes in is giving us this new pixel fusion server technology that seems to us might be a really good place to develop this set, a really good system to use as a test bed environment for developing and doing research on this set. And this is his slide, basically, that just tells, sort of some of the characteristics of this server or this test bed environment. And I think that's my quad chart that you don't need to see. And also, what I want to I want to take questions, but I also want to let everybody know, and I passed out some, but I didn't have, I don't think, enough for everybody, so I passed out early on some. We also have a meta-information portrayal workshop that's our kind of second annual meta-information portrayal workshop, where we want to look at different ways that it might make sense. We're looking at different ways to portray what we term as meta-information, which are things like uncertainty, recency, and very dependent on what you call meta-information is very dependent on what the context is. I mean, in one case, if you're just interested in the tank as the information, then maybe how much gas that tank is might be meta-information, but if you're interested in the fuel, that's on the field, then the meta-information might be how uncertain you are about the amount of fuel that the tank has. So all that shifts from use to use and context to context. But we want to look at different ways of portraying that, not only visually. So if you know of auditory people that might be interested in coming, or tactile ways to do that, we're also interested in exploring those things. But that's in Washington, D.C. next month, or this month. This is August already, right? Okay, later this month, at a really, really nice hotel. So you'll all have fun if you come. But we do have some kind of limited capacity, and I think the hotel cuts our per diem rate block of rooms off the 6th. So if you're interested in coming, you might want to hurry up and go ahead and make your reservations to do that. And any questions about this?
Actually, some of this talk today about how video games have really pushed the envelope on some of these ways how to communicate with these kind of things, with perhaps the real-time strategy games. I've looked into that and how they communicate health or fuel or ammo, or and then there's different. I've seen things where there's different views. You can just say a different view. I'm just interested in information, or I'm interested in the fuel view, or the ammunition, or
yeah. And we just
how to communicate that.
We have just started looking at some of those, and I'm really totally not game proficient. I'm beyond that age, but we have been looking at some of those. The things that we've been looking at right now have been more things like where they have little charts up at the top that you can access that, and then it'll give you. It's usually weapons, like what weapons you have. Here's what you have and what you don't have, and so we've looked at ways of doing that. And that's probably be some of the stuff that we test inside of this environment once we've started building things and putting them together. They'll probably, the things that we've found so far have been things that are more external to the entity itself. So, you know, ways of switching over, like you said, switching views or pulling up some kind of piece of information about it where it'll display it elsewhere on the screen. So but we are looking into doing that also as something, as part of our research and something to test.
Since knowledge is very dynamic, especially in this field, how do you deal with that in the knowledge cliff?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
Because the knowledge is not static knowledge that you are dealing with. They are changing.
Yeah, we would expect that whatever we have would be the current, you know, a current snapshot. Basically, we've taken a sort of a easy way out in that we're looking in a command environment, whereas what Lorraine's talking about is out in the field, and that's much more difficult. For the same reason, I'm a vision scientist, and for the same reason that, you know, I just don't want to deal with the cockpit displays. I'd much rather be in this command environment because everything is a lot more stable. We have a lot more, you know, frequent information and a lot more stable displays.
That's kind of the interesting thing about the military domain is that you can really constrain it
Right.
and create boundaries quite reasonably,
Right.
and it makes the problem a little easier to tackle. But
Yeah, so
when you try to expand it,
Yeah.
it's a little more difficult.
so I took an easy route. I know I did. back in.
Is the Army and the Air Force, I mean, the Army and the Navy helping you develop this glyph set?
We're collaborating a bit with them on things like, there are people from there coming to like this workshop, but we haven't been working together with them specifically on this glyph set. We have started collaborating between directorates and Air Force Research Lab, which is already a big deal for us, sadly to say. But we do have the Information Directorate working with us in the Human Factors Directorate, and we've put together this little collaboration to look at this stuff. And it's very sad, but that's about as far as we get. There's really weird funding issues with trying to get to people. We even have trouble doing things for the JFAC, which is the Joint, you know, Command Environment, just because if the Air Force if they give you money for the Air Force, then they just get aggravated if you try to use it to support other people, and it's all silly, and I don't have anything to do with any of that, so I try to stay.
I see that you have a small business innovative research.
Yeah, we've had a couple of SIBRs that I've written a couple of SIBR topics. We had an STTR topic, which is like a SIBR small business, but it's also involves some university research or collaboration, usually for more basic research.
So that's going to transition into the program of record in the Air Force?
Well, SPIR and STTR technology generally just is supposed to transition into business. That's all proprietary to the business that does that. So how they transition it and commercialize it is up to them, not necessarily us. Yes?
I just want to argue that comment in the beginning there. I want to argue that you didn't take the easy way out. The problem of any cognitive science problem that we're trying to deal with is what we would call AI hard. It's remarkably difficult. So choosing low-hanging fruit or constrained environments is remarkably important. So you did the right thing, I think. You didn't take the easy way out.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes?
Have you started looking at what level of ambiguity in your glyphs is considered desirable? Because there are times when you don't want things to be very, very concrete. And that's one of the good things about something like the MIL Standard 2525 is that your icons almost are a conceptual representative. I have a friendly air track. You don't put up a picture of an FA-18.
Right.
Because what if it is someone who is pretending to be and then all of a sudden they no longer are? So you are intentionally ambiguous in a good way, as opposed to something that's very, very concrete, that when it changes, when the information set around it changes, people's memory is such that they say, wait a minute, I don't understand. They get a mental disconnect between, oh, I thought that was this, and now you're telling me it's this, and I don't know what to believe anymore. So you started looking at how ambiguous is good, and where is it do you need to be concrete, where is it that you need to be ambiguous?
Well, we have looked at ways to sort of telescope the ambiguity, but I think the question of where it's good and bad is ultimately sort of depends on the operational environment that we choose.
Right.
So since we haven't really got a concrete operational environment and, you know, a specific set yet, we haven't really gone further and looked at when it's right to use one and when it's right to use another.
And I think just as a comment to that, it's kind of interesting that you brought it up. The fact that you would want to be intentionally ambiguous, but that you don't know the measure of your ambiguity. The fact that you're measuring uncertainty is actually kind of nice to be able to associate a metric with ambiguity. I think that's a good way to go.
And again, this is part of this meta information workshop that's coming up that I'm really trying to plug here. But I think we have about 20 spaces left open, actually. Any other questions? Yes.
Curious that we're talking about Glyphs so much, and one of the data points you mentioned earlier was fuel. And it occurs to me that in the computer environment, you don't actually have to represent that information by, say, an icon. We could have a map with range of a vehicle, for example. Is that off topic? Do you consider those types of information or ways of expressing
That is ways that we've considered in these blobs that I showed you, and sometimes we've done like we've looked at representing like, well, this is how far something could go instead of specifically how much fuel it has. It just ultimately, all of this is so contextually dependent and so dependent on the particular use and environment, and that we've rapidly realized that we really have to just pick an environment to do some of this research and you know, look at what the specific needs of that operational environment are. And I don't know if I've answered your question at all. You have a look on your face like I haven't, so.
No, you have.
Okay.
I just wonder what other types of data can be represented.
Yeah, well, we're hoping a lot. We just haven't ultimately quite got there. Anybody else? No? Good. I'll put this down. It's been like a little... Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. That was great. Unless we would like to take a break, does anyone raise of hands, take a break, or keep going? I guess we keep going.
I can take a bio, but I do that by myself. Nobody else wants.
You got it.
Yes, on my own.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker is Dr. Sherman Wilcox, and he is the, I believe, department chair of the Human Linguistics program. And I met Dr. Wilcox, I think my first week here in New Mexico. He was one of the first individuals I met at the university, and he was incredibly receptive to our ideas and the idea of collaborating with space-enabled warfare. So he's going to talk about his work in cognitive iconicity.
Thank you. And as the first hometown person, I guess I would like to welcome all of you to the University of New Mexico campus into Albuquerque. You've managed to come during our monsoon season, so I apologize that the nice weather is happening out there right now while you're in here, and when you get done, it's going to be raining, probably. So I apologize for that. I'm also probably the first linguist to talk this morning at the conference, and I apologize for that, too. For being the linguist.
Anything else you want to confess to?
We'll see. As the talk goes along, we'll see. So a little bit of an overview. I'm going to talk about why cognitive iconicity. What is this concept of cognitive iconicity, which is dependent on cognitive grammar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive grammar, not nearly enough, although probably more than you would like. I will then talk about cognitive iconicity and metaphor, and talk about how the two relate to each other, and with some examples from American Sign Language primarily. That's the language that I work on. And then some next steps, and I actually have a coda at the end if there's time permitting. And I have no idea what's going on with time right now. So if there's time permitting, I have one final example of cognitive iconicity in American Sign Language. So why cognitive iconicity? Well, I work on American Sign Language, and my background in linguistics is in cognitive grammar, a particular type of approach to linguistics, which is probably very different than the frameworks that all are familiar with. It's a very different approach to formal linguistics. Those of us who work with sign languages know that there is rampant iconicity in sign languages, and this is something that we have had to deal with. So cognitive iconicity was my own attempt at reconciling iconicity, and the iconicity that I was seeing in signed languages, with a cognitive grammar framework, kind of understanding what iconicity is within a cognitive grammar framework. Cognitive grammar is this framework of linguistics that takes a very radical, different approach to the study of language. Some of the basic assumptions of cognitive grammar are that grammar and meaning are indissociable. This is very different than the formalist approach. Meaning is equated with conceptualization. For cognitive grammar, grammar reduces to the structuring and symbolization of conceptual content. The lexicon, morphology, syntax, all of language, in fact, requires nothing more than 3 types of linguistic structures, which are semantic structures, phonological structures, and symbolic structures. Symbolic structures are the linking of the first two, of phonological structures and semantic structures, which are sometimes called the 2 poles of a symbolic structure. If this were a talk really on linguistics, I would emphasize that all of language, not only the lexicon, morphology, and even syntax, is symbolic for a cognitive grammarian. Syntax has a phonological pole and a semantic pole. So semantic structures. Semantic structures are quite complex, or at least they can be quite complex. That complexity can be described in terms of figure-ground relationships, of perspective, of schematicity. I'll return to this notion of schematicity, of compositionality, of whether it's composed of parts, and autonomy dependency. I won't really talk about autonomy dependency this morning, so I won't talk about it. Semantic structures, in semantic structures, meaning is specified within a complex encyclopedic network. And while a linguistic unit may profile one element in the network, local aspects of the network are also accessible as parts of the base. So for example, fingernail, finger, hand, arm, body. When we say fingernail, it profiles a specific aspect, but accessible within that profile are all these aspects of the base at various levels of accessibility. Phonological structures are the other pole of this symbolic structure. Phonological structures are the physical manifestation of language. For spoken languages, they are acoustic arrays. Acoustic arrays are for spoken languages. For sign languages, they are optical arrays. Phonological structure, the phonological pole of language we need to recognize is also conceptual. One way that we can demonstrate that is with this linguistic notion of phonemes, different acoustic arrays that are within one language conceptually regarded as the same sound. And for sign languages, the phonological structures involve objects moving in space, something that I think has a lot of significance for the study of iconicity in sign languages. Now, another way we can think about this is in terms of conceptual spaces. Cognitive grammar actually was, this whole framework of cognitive grammar was proposed by Ronald Lanneker, a linguist who's now retired from the University of California, San Diego. And when he first proposed it about almost 25 years ago, it was termed space grammar. And I think that was, people thought that was just too wacky of a term. They thought it had to do with outer space or something. But it doesn't. It has to do with conceptual spaces, space grammar. Think of all of this in terms of conceptual spaces. A conceptual space is the multifaceted field of conceptual potential within which thought and conceptualization unfold. So conceptual space is multidimensional with subregions or certain domains. For example, we can think of a very large subregion of conceptual space, which would be non-linguistic, and subregions within that conceptual space of color, which also then would have its own subregions of hue and saturation. Sound, movement, space, many other subdomains. There's also a large subdomain which is linguistic, and within the linguistic subdomain there is a semantic space and a phonological space. And once again, this is a multidimensional conceptual space, and each one of these subdomains are also multidimensional. So there are certain, within the linguistic subdomain, there are certain major dimensions of conceptual space. One is schematicity, the other one is symbolic complexity. Schematicity is a way of talking about our cognitive ability to conceive and portray entities. It's a way of talking about our cognitive ability to conceive and portray entities at varying levels of precision and detail. So for example, we can talk about Chianti, wine, beverage, liquid, substance at different levels of precision and detail, right? Where we name it in fairly precise detail. Chianti, we could get even more precise than that. Wine, beverage, liquid, substance. I'd just like to point out that schematicity, but as a matter of fact, many of the features of the dimensions that we use to talk about language within the cognitive grammar framework have an analogy with vision. We saw that before. I talked about figure ground, which obviously has an analogy or a basis in visual perception with perspective. Schematicity also does. There's an analogy with visual perception for schematicity, and that is that it has to do with distance, right? So the closer up we view something, typically we view it with more precision, whereas the farther away we view something, we lose that resolution, we lose that precision and detail. So there is this analogy with visual perception, even for schematicity. Symbolic complexity has to do with the extent to which an expression or a linguistic unit is decomposable into smaller symbolic elements. So an example of this is sharp, sharpen, which has two elements, sharpener, pencil sharpener, electric pencil sharpener. And both semantic and phonological, there is both semantic and phonological compositionality, right? We see that in these examples, as a matter of fact. Okay, and one other concept that's important within the cognitive grammar framework is construal. Construal is the ability to portray the same conceptual content in various ways, resulting in substantially different meanings. Construal factors that play a role in construal that allow us to formulate different construals are specificity, schematicity, figure ground, perspective, scope, prominence, and so on. Perspective, I think we understand what all of these are. Specificity is that specificity, schematicity feature again. Figure ground, I think we understand. Perspective, we also understand saying that what do I want to say here? That Jill is sitting in front of Lorraine as opposed to Lorraine is sitting behind Jill. It's a matter of perspective. Not quite right, but works. Scope has, I won't go into this. If you want to ask me questions about this during the question and answer, I'll do that. So, to kind of summarize it, we have this multidimensional conceptual space. Within that, there is a subdomain of language, which is also multidimensional. And within that, we have a region of phonological space. Once again, acoustic phonological space for spoken language, optical phonological space for sign languages. And our symbolic structure is links a point in phonological space and a point in semantic space. That forms either a word or a phrase or any kind of or a morpheme, any kind of a symbolic structure within language. Okay, so that's kind of the background, very, very briefly, too briefly, that sets the stage for talking about iconicity. I want to point out that from my perspective, iconicity is relational. Iconicity is a relational concept. In traditional terms, iconicity has been regarded as the relation between form and a real-world referent. So here's a little quote that I've taken off the web, as a matter of fact. Iconicity as a semiotic notion refers to the natural resemblance or analogy between the form of a sign and the object or concept it refers to in the world, or rather our perception of the world. So, in cognitive iconicity, iconicity is still a relational term. It's a relational notion, but it's not a relational notion between form and meaning in the world, or referent in the world. It's a relational notion between two locations in this multidimensional conceptual space. One of them in the phonological domain and the other in the semantic domain. And in the cognitive grammar perspective, then iconicity is a distance metric. When the phonological pole and the semantic pole of a linguistic unit are close in conceptual space, the unit is regarded as more iconic. And when they are more distant, the relation between the form and meaning is perceived as more arbitrary. So cognitive iconicity is this distance relationship in a multidimensional conceptual space between a phonological location and a semantic location in conceptual space. Now, for sign languages, this works fine for things like tree, where we have a sign that looks like what it means, and for a sign for book, or a sign that looks like what it means. So we have when we have objects that exist in the real world, this seems to work just fine. But what if there are no real world referents? This would seem to pose a problem for traditional notions of iconicity if there's no real world referent for the form to resemble. And as an example, what about the notion of nouns and verbs? What about grammatical class? So I'm not talking about a particular noun or verb. I'm talking about the grammatical class, noun and verb. How can a word or a sign look like a noun, not a specific noun, just the grammatical class noun? Or how can it look like verb? Well, within cognitive grammar regards grammatical classes as symbolic units, so they also have a phonological pole and a semantic pole as a grammatical class. The semantic pole is necessarily of either one of these is necessarily highly schematic, as is the phonological pole. In English, it's so schematic as to only represent there is some phonological content. I don't think that in English we have a common phonological representation of all nouns or all verbs. Only there is some phonological content there. They're pronounceable, but that's about it. So within cognitive grammar, though, the semantic pole of these grammatical classes do have a notional or a meaning definition. And I don't have time to really go into enough detail to probably make this understandable, but what you need to know is that there is this notional basis which means it's a semantic basis for the grammatical class. So within cognitive grammar, a noun is regarded as a thing, and a thing there is a technical term, unfortunately. A thing, it's a unitary entity resulting from conceptual reification. And a verb is regarded as a process. Process here is also a technical term. It's a relationship that evolves through time and is scanned sequentially, as opposed to summarily, along the temporal axis. By scanning sequentially, we scan something through time as it proceeds. Summarily, we scan something while something that is proceeding through time is scanned in a summary fashion. Linguistically, I can demonstrate this as the difference between cross and across. So when I mentally understand cross, I'm scanning this sequential time as I cross. Across, we mentally scan this again, there's a mental scanning of that process, but the mental scanning takes place summarily across. If that doesn't work for you, another way of getting this is if I were to throw an eraser across the room. I don't have something that I can throw across the room without breaking it. But if I were to throw an eraser or an object across the room and then ask you put up 3 different pictures of the arc that it traveled, you would be able to answer the question of which one of those arcs represented the arc of the, is it this kind, did it travel in this kind of a path? Did it travel in this kind of a path? Or did it travel in this kind of a path? Right, and I draw the path, of course, as a static path. The reason you are able to do that is because you are scanning what is a temporal process and in conceiving of it in a summary fashion as a static arc. Right, that's the difference there. Okay. In cognitive grammar, these 2 grammatical classes, noun and verb, are represented in one of these cognitive grammar diagrams. A noun is on the left there, and the black line is representing that it's a unitary entity, this conceptual reification of what might be a process, but it's seen as a conceptual entity. And on the right, the verb, the dark line is representing the scanning through time. Now, there are things in ASL called noun-verb pairs. There are certain words in ASL, certain noun and verb pairs, that are formally quite the same, phonologically quite similar. So there are certain nouns and verbs in ASL that share respectively phonological features. For example, airplane and fly by plane, the noun airplane, and the verb to fly by plane. Chair, sit, and to sit, chair, and to sit. And book, I showed you this before, and to open a book. And there's probably hundreds of these noun-verb pairs in American Sign Language. Well, again, without going into enough detail of explaining, what I'm suggesting is that the form of these signs is iconic for the grammatical class. The form of the signs here, so you see here kind of a matching up where the form of the sign for noun, which has this constrained movement in a constrained location in space, and the form of the equivalent verb in that noun-verb pair, which has the more unrestrained and larger movement, is iconic for the grammatical class. Let me kind of summarize that a little bit. The articulation of ASL nouns, the articulation of ASL noun forms in a restricted region of space then motivates their construal as things at the phonological pole. Verb forms make salient in their articulation motion through space, and they are construed as sequentially scanned processes at their phonological pole. And the mapping of that phonological thing and process at the phonological pole onto semantic thing, which is a noun, and semantic process, which is the notional definition of grammatical class verb, respectively, then makes these noun-verb pairs highly iconic. Not for the specific meaning of the nouns and verbs that they represent. Yes, this does look like a book. So does this, as a matter of fact. And yes, this probably does resemble an airplane. That's not the point I'm trying to make. This form resembles a noun, and this form resembles a verb class, right? And so this is a way that we can talk about iconicity for things that have no existence in the real world, grammatical classes. Now, I want to talk a little bit about metaphor and how metaphor relates to cognitive iconicity. Metaphor, we all know, is a mapping across 2 distinct domains in semantic space. Metaphor is a mapping in semantic space. It's a conceptual phenomenon in which a target semantic domain is understood with reference to another, usually more basic source domain. So one type of metaphor is what's called an ontological metaphor, and this is a metaphor in which an abstraction, such as an activity, an emotion, or an idea, is represented as something concrete, such as an object, a substance, a container, or a person. What we have then is If we regard knowledge as a substance, if we do this metaphorical mapping of knowledge as a substance, what we are doing is mapping a particular word, knowledge, for example, which has a phonological, it has a point in phonological space to represent its pronunciation, a point in semantic space to represent its meaning, and we are mapping that onto a different location in phonological space and semantic space, perhaps, right? So, and what we have then is something like the mind or the brain is a container, and therefore knowledge may be manipulated and put into the mind. In ASL, we have the same form that's used for manipulating objects. To pick up this napkin and give it to Emily is this. For her to give it to me is this. We have that same form that's used for to learn, which is then putting something in the mind, putting an object in the mind. Or understanding is grasping, and we see this in various other sign languages. Italian Sign Language, for example, uses this for to understand, where understanding is grasping. So in cognitive iconicity then, and metaphor, in the cognitive grammar view of all of this, metaphorical mappings change distance relations in conceptual space. Because they map one semantic pole onto one region in semantic space onto another region in semantic space, because they are doing a mapping of the source domain onto a target domain. They are moving locations in semantic space by doing that. And by mapping the target domain onto a source domain, the semantic pole of symbolic unit is moved in conceptual space. If the new location happens to be closer to the unit's phonological pole, then cognitive iconicity has been created. If we have moved a location in semantic space to a new location in semantic space, and that new location happens to end up being closer to the phonological space of that symbolic unit, then we have made that linguistic unit more iconic. And the way I view this is metaphor then is a type of wormhole in semantic space. By moving something that used to be at location A to location B, if we had to follow along outside of that wormhole, we would have a large distance, but by moving it by means of a metaphor, by mapping time onto money or good onto up, and bad onto down, we have moved things, then we have moved something at the semantic pole, then we have created the possibility of moving it closer to its phonological representation. And if that was the case, then we would have created iconicity. So, some next steps. One, how do we determine semantic locations in conceptual space? Well, as I mentioned, I started doing this merely because of my interest in American Sign Language and cognitive grammar, and trying to put these two together, trying to understand what iconicity is in terms of cognitive grammar so that I could deal with the iconicity that I see in sign languages. As I worked more with this idea of cognitive iconicity, I realize now that this question, I think there are people working on coming up with answers to this question. How do we determine semantic locations in conceptual space? And there is quite a bit of work on this. Some examples are this articulating conceptual spaces using the topic map standard, and the idea of multidimensional scaling meanings as regions in conceptual space. This is not new territory of trying to understand meanings as locations in conceptual space. But we also have to then determine phonological locations. How do we determine phonological locations? For me, working in a signed language, that seems somewhat easier than for working in spoken languages. As I mentioned, sign languages take place in three-dimensional space, right? They take place with objects that have shapes and locations and certain qualities in three-dimensional space. And very often that's what we're dealing with when we talk about semantic structures, is we're talking about objects in three-dimensional space. For spoken language, the phonological pole is necessarily always a location in acoustic space. How do we develop a metric for determining distance in conceptual space is another question. Right? So once we know, if we can determine where something is in semantic space, within conceptual space, and if we can determine where something exists within phonological space, either acoustic or optical phonological space, how do we then determine a distance between those? And a final question is how modality, the spoken versus acoustic or signed, the spoken acoustic and signed optical modality of language affect the cognitive iconicity and its interaction with metonymy, which I didn't talk about this morning, and metaphor. I think one of the obvious answers is that one of the reasons that sign languages are much more iconic than spoken languages is because of the optical modality that sign languages exist in. The fact that we have languages that, for their phonological expression, are objects moving in space with locations and all of those kinds of spatial features just opens up a much more richly, a rich possibility of iconicity. And that's all I have. Yes?
I just have a question about Chinese,
Yeah.
which was originally, obviously, the original pictographs are called pictographs because they were so iconic. How much of a relationship do you find between that and, say, sign language, that kind of iconography? And I'm not sure how much still exists in Chinese, but I know that originally they were formed out of pictograms.
Yeah, well, I'm not, I know nothing about Chinese orthographic systems, and that's what we're talking about, right? So we're not talking about spoken Chinese or in any kind of iconicity that might exist in spoken Chinese. We're talking about, yeah. So I'm not an expert. I know nothing about Chinese as a language or Chinese as an orthography.
So they don't.
Can I add a few words here? Most of the Chinese characters are formed using those iconic operators. In fact, many of them can be explained as the conceptual merge of the ideas for the individual iconic parts.
It's not going to have anything to do with what I'm going to talk about, but at the end of my talk, if you remind me, I put in an extra slide to account for just that very type of question. And I can address that sort of issue.
I had
Stalled.
I had a number of questions, and I'll ask them, and you can answer them when you want to now, and then we can do the rest offline. The first one is, so as you just said, you dealt with spoken, not orthographic aspects of language, not written. Though chat is solely written and has its own iconic attributes, right? Which seem to me to map a great deal to paralinguistic aspects in either spoken or signed language. So the wink emoticon is partially a facial expression, right? The big grin emoticon is my saying what I was saying with this horribly large grin. And obviously you don't have the whole richness of paralinguistic aspects in chat that you do. So I guess my question is, have you thought about how paralinguistics affects this relation between your two spaces? I mean, because your two spaces are solely, semantics is affected by the paralinguistic, although the sign may not be. So have you thought about that? And then have you thought about the way it works with chat? And the last one is, as the computer scientist in me is really excited about the metric idea, because what we're going to get from the signal is simply the phonological aspects of it.
Right.
And then we would want to, if we had a metric, we could make a guess at where in the semantic space it was by looking at context and guessing the closest, or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the first question about paralinguistics, let me take one stab at it. I mean, I think it's a very complex thing to be talking about.
I didn't expect a total solution.
Yeah. Thinking about paralinguistics and the emoticons, what you have is a very, I'm always struck by when we look at iconicity, it seems like a fairly simple thing, right? So an emoticon is it's iconic. You know, all of us recognize it as an icon, and it's iconic. But it seems like when you start analyzing it, it's extremely complex. The reason why it's iconic and why it's an emoticon. So, and yes, you're right. It's paralinguistic. It is referencing some paralinguistic something going on. It's referencing that paralinguistic thing going on, which might be represented in our voices in spoken language, in an emoticon by the facial expression, right? And the facial expression is pointing to, not the facial expression. We're not interested in the facial expression there. The facial expression is actually pointing to how you interpret what this means, right? And so there's a type of, I didn't talk about metonymy. I had metonymy in here, and I would run over my time with talking about how cognitive grammar regards metonymy, and then how that plays into iconicity. Metonymy in cognitive grammar there's a couple ways that it's thought about, but one way it's thought about is that metonymy is a type of reference point. Reference point phenomenon. A reference point, a way you can think about a reference point is in giving directions. So when I say, do you know where the Tamarind Institute is? Nobody knows where the Tamarind Institute is. You know where the Frontier Restaurant is? Yeah, well, it's right behind that. So we use the Frontier Restaurant, something that has a lot of prominence, people that know where that is, as a reference point, as an entry into talking about something else. Right? So when I say, the tuna fish when a waitress says the tuna fish sandwich wants his check now to another waitress, we're using something that's highly prominent, the food order, to refer to the customer, right? And that's kind of what's going on here too in these emoticons, right? So we're using the facial expression, something that is highly prominent, as a reference point, as a metonymy for this whole other complex thing that's going on, possibly the way that thing was pronounced and the way we should interpret that.
So given some phonological string, right, written or sequence of signs, it's possible that could map to more than one semantic space. In different contexts, would map to more than one place in semantic space. And the paralinguistic aspects or the emoticon aspects or even the sarcasm in my voice pointed to a different part of semantic space.
That's right.
Is that
That's right.
Did I understand correctly?
Yeah, no, that's right. Certainly for cognitive linguistics, for cognitive grammar, what I feel most comfortable with, polysemy is the rule. Polysemy is ubiquitous, right? And so one of the reactions I've had this morning listening to people talk about ambiguity and whether we want ambiguity, I think what many of you talk about as ambiguity, I think I would call polysemy. And the idea that we wouldn't want polysemy seems bizarre to me, right? I mean, the only reason language works is because we have polysemy. If we had to have one term for every possible notion, every possible concept, we wouldn't have things like red, right? Because there are how many different shades and hues of red? And is red a noun or is red a verb? An adjective. Right? So this napkin is red, right? So the red napkin, as opposed to I spilled red all over the driveway this morning.
I think the dangerous listening is there was a chemical spill, and look out, you may cause a chemical spill. Right? If you interpret those incorrectly, you could die or not die.
Can we? I'm going to interject just so we can get on to lunch.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
And we've got one more speaker before lunch. We've got plenty of time tomorrow for discussion, and we can talk in as much detail as we want about any of the topics.
Good. You want this?
What a cognitive linguistics approach to a particular conceptual or grammatical problem in American Sign Language would be. So thanks for doing that penitente cognitive linguistics introduction for me. But one thing I want to say before I start is I want to talk a little tiny bit about the status of sign languages and sort of how we got to be where we are today, because Sherman didn't mention that in his talk. Early in linguistics, in sign language linguistics research, so the late 60s, the early 70s, linguists before my time, spent the better part of their time trying to prove that signed languages were languages. So a lot of the early research was trying to convince people that these really were languages. We finally made it past that. However, we're in an interesting time now where we seem to be butting up against spoken language structural criteria as the way we have to define ourselves as signed languages. So when we want to define something or when we want to describe a particular conceptual category or grammatical notion, we often find ourselves having to say, yes, that's the way a spoken language does it, or more particularly, yes, that's the way English does it, but this is a signed language, and let us maybe learn something about language from what we're finding in this signed language. So I'm going to talk a little bit then about passives, the notion of passive constructions in American Sign Language. So think back to the last time you studied passives or the last time you were told passives were wrong and what you remember passives being. Okay, so back in 2001, a couple of my colleagues and I, Barbara O'Day, who's a doctoral student at UNM, and Terry Jansen, who's my co-author on this, by the way, and I looked at what we considered to be passive constructions in American Sign Language. And what we found was that we saw a certain type of construction that was being viewed from a different perspective. Sherman talked about construal. So we looked at constructions that were being viewed from the perspective of the patient of the construction, not the agent. So we often hear about sentences like, the boy kicked the dog, the boy being the agent, the dog being the patient, the dog being the receiver, and the boy being the doer of that. And we looked at constructions in American Sign Language where it was being construed as and viewed from the perspective of the patient. Sherman also mentioned that sign languages exist in space and function in space. So what we found was the signer very often became the patient and then viewed the scene from his perspective and then built the sentence around his perspective as the patient. And we started seeing that again and again in American Sign Language, and we formulated sort of an initial hypothesis of what a passive construction looks like. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, and then I'm going to talk about our current research and our current data, and do a little bit of a comparison between agents and patients and agentive clauses and what we're calling passive clauses. Back when we began this work, we were repeatedly being told that ASL didn't have a passive, and in fact that sign languages had no voice. And I know that sounds funny because they're sign languages, but we're talking about the other kind of voice. So we were repeatedly told and repeatedly reading that sign languages didn't have a voice, that everything was an active clause in sign languages. And Isenhath is a good example because he looked for a syntactic structure. He looked for, like English, we have a way that an active clause is done, and then we know that we switch things around with respect to the verb and we get the passive. So he looked for that in American Sign Language, again using English as his benchmark, and determined that there was no passive construction in ASL, and he actually claimed that there were no passives in any signed language. We then, as I mentioned, went looking for constructions where the scene was viewed from the perspective of the patient. And we found that very often the way the verb was set up was different. It wasn't a syntactic difference. It was a construal difference, and it was a how the verb was formulated difference. And how, when we asked people how they interpreted the clause. They didn't interpret it in an active sort of way, they interpreted it in a passive sort of way, as being about the patient rather than being about the agent. So our conclusion based on our pilot study was that certain constructions could be viewed as being passive constructions. Again, this is using a cognitive approach, not a structural, formal approach to linguistics. So then I guess we would need a cognitive definition of a passive. And this is, the first using comes from Bybee 1985, and she says that changes in voice are signaled by changes in the functional role of the nominals. So their roles in the sentence change, as opposed to their position in the sentence changes. Tommy Gavon, another cognitive functional linguist, says that the same semantically transitive event, so the same event with respect to the verb, coded by the very same verb agent and patient can be rendered by several discourse pragmatic perspectives. So either an active, a middle voice, a passive. Again, here's a couple of other definitions. And the one that I'm particularly interested in here is that the agent is demoted. Okay? In an English passive, we know that we can just get rid of the agent in a lot of cases. We can just say the dog was kicked. We don't even have to have the boy in the sentence. It can be completely removed. So we were very interested in an ASL passive, how demoted is the agent? Is the agent there at all, or is the agent altogether gone? Okay, and this is another quote from Bill Croft, who's on faculty here in the linguistics department at UNM. And he says, the variation in structure makes it difficult, if not impossible, to use structural criteria, or only structural criteria, to identify grammatical categories across languages. Although there's some similarity in structure, again, the formal properties, that may be used for cross-linguistic identification of categories, the ultimate solution is a semantic one, or to put it more generally, a functional one. So it's what are these elements doing in a sentence as opposed to what is the structure of the sentence. So we know that some languages rely on word order changes, and we know that some languages rely on a passivizing morpheme, a morpheme stuck on the verb. And so we began looking at what signed languages do. Now, the sentence that I'm going to show you here is from our database. It's actually, we asked someone to show us a prototypical ASL active clause. And what you're going to be looking at here, in the bottom, it says, France gave the Golden Boy. The Golden Boy is a statue in Manitoba. And France gave the Golden Boy to the Manitoba government as a gift. And the verb is give. And this is an active clause. And he's going to be doing give from himself as the agent of the clause outward. So you're going to be looking for that. So he's signing it from himself as the agent, giving it. And in this, he's France, the agent. Okay? So all I wanted you to see was that give from the agent to the patient being Manitoba. Now I have the very same signer giving you a passive construction. This is actually, he had done this in a story, so we just had him recreate this one because it was so good. And this is a little complex. In the Manitoba government, on the Capitol building, there's this Golden Boy, this big statue. They took the Golden Boy down to re-gild it, to put new gold on it. And so while they had it down, they put it in a little museum and they let people come and see it up close because people had only ever seen it on this big old building. And so people were lining up to see this statue. And when you lined up to see the statue, the people there gave you a little pin called the Golden Boy. So we have two Golden Boys now. And he's saying that when he visited the Golden Boy, he was given a Golden Boy pin. Okay? So this time you're going to watch him sign give again, but this time he's the patient of the sentence and he's being given the pin, the Golden Boy pin. Okay, so he was given a Golden Boy pin. Okay? Now, what's interesting in this example is we have no idea who gave the pin. I mean, I'm assuming it wasn't a random stranger just wandering around handing out pins. It was probably someone from this project or someone from, you know, the Manitoba Tourism Department or something. But we don't really know, and it doesn't really matter because it's about him receiving this pin. It's not about who did the giving, per se. But what I'm going to talk about then is where is the agent and what's it doing and does it have any actual role in the sentence? Okay. In our early work, we looked at what it was that made a passive. And we looked at the fact that it was from the patient's perspective and that the patient was highly topical. The patient was the point of the sentence, what the sentence was about. And that the agent was defocused, demoted, whatever we want to call it. And then we also suggested that they weren't deployable. And what we meant by that was in the very next sentence, you couldn't really use the agent without naming it because it hasn't been named. So you can't then go on and say he because we don't know which he it is. So in the case of the Golden Boy, we know that he was given something. But if the very next sentence, if David said he was wearing brown, we don't know who he is. We don't know that he's talking about the guy who gave him the golden boy. So that agent isn't deployable, is what we had hypothesized. We had also hypothesized that the eye gaze of the patient, that the patient would be looking at the agent during these things when they were the recipient of the action. And we also believed that there would be some pretty interesting morphology between the agent and the patient. In our more recent work, we've been looking at some of the work of a cognitive linguist at Gallaudet that Jill Morford's been working with as well, named Paul Dudas, who looks at the notion of body partitioning. And what he has discovered, or what he's described for ASL and for a couple of other sign languages, is that when the signer is signing something, they are simultaneously showing themselves as the narrator, and in the case of the passives, the patient, but there's something about the agent in there. So in the case of the golden boy, those are the hands of the agent giving the golden boy to the patient. Those aren't David's hands in that context. They're not David's hands as the patient. They're the guy giving it, his hands. So the body is split conceptually. But as the person watching the story, you just know that those are that guy's hands and not the patient's hands. Okay, so we suddenly had to take on this idea of body partitioning and the fact that the signer's body can become part of the agent and a lot of the patient at the same time. So what we did was, well, for spoken language linguists, there are a lot of big piles of data around, and the spoken language linguists in the room know this. For sign language linguists, we're not quite so lucky. There don't exist big databases of signed languages, just conversational data out there. So we have begun in Manitoba and New Mexico collecting data. And so we collected, well, we started by analyzing 5 conversational texts between ASL L1 users, people for whom ASL is a first language, and then 2 narrative passages, one-person narrative passages from some longer conversational texts. We found 21 patient perspective clauses and 50 active clauses in that small chunk of time. And so we're not suggesting, don't want anyone to get us wrong here, that all patient perspective clauses are passive. We're not saying that. But we're sort of suggesting that an overt patient perspective is there, and that we want to look at what the agent is doing in those and whether or not they can best be considered a passive. So in those clauses that we've coded, we looked for whether or not there was an overt agent, whether there was a presence of an agent, whether it was just the hands of the agent or something else about the agent, how the agent was marked, and then also how do those passive clauses compare to active clauses. And what we found was that in the data that we've coded so far, there was 1 full noun phrase in a passive construction. 1 full noun phrase. And there were 5 pronouns, 12 that were marked with just spatial marking, so out there in space, 3 that were marked with a classifier. Not important, so I won't explain what a classifier is right now. And what was interesting was noun phrases and pronouns combined were only 28.6%, whereas spatial marking and classifiers were 71%. So in our passive constructions, only 28% of them had something resembling a noun phrase, either a noun phrase or a pronoun in them.
ASL has classifiers?
ASL has things that are commonly called classifiers that are up for debate.
Not like higher Chinese classifiers.
Very different in that. Yeah, we can certainly talk about that because it's a whole ball of wax, whether or not they're actually classifiers. Okay. What we have here is one of our actual first data examples. This is a deaf woman talking to a deaf man in Manitoba. And oh, again, it's kind of funny when you use real data, you don't get to control what they talk about. So some of these are kind of bizarre. This one, I think I cut out the bizarre part. A woman is talking to a man about the fact that Canada is getting what's called video relay, whereby a deaf person can call a hearing person and see an interpreter on a TV screen who interprets the phone call. Okay, US has that, and Canada's excited because they're getting that. And she's saying that she's heard that if you misuse your video phone and if you misuse the service, that the operators will recognize your name and cut the call and so you'll be blocked from using the service. And I think I did cut out the strange part of it, because what she says is that she's heard something, and what she's heard is that if you answer the phone naked or use a lot of profanity, that the service won't take your calls anymore. Okay? Let's see if I left that in there. I'm not actually sure. I want you to look at this once, and then I'll talk about it. And she says, I heard, it was signed to me that VRS has started cutting calls. When they see your name, if they know who you are, they'll cut the call and they won't answer it. And that's because sometimes you're standing there naked, or you use a lot of profanity. Is that true? And then he says, yes, it's true. Okay? But what she says at the very beginning, and I'm not going to show it to you again because it's about that big, so I'll sign it, is she says this. She says, I heard, a metaphorical heard, I'm assuming. I heard, and then she says, it was signed to me. Okay? So, and it was signed to her by someone in some other time, in some other place. But all that's there is that other person's hand signing something to her. Okay? You have a question?
Just for the non-hands up, where's the past tense of that?
Oh, it's just contextual. Yeah. Yeah, it's just contextual. Yeah. So it was signed to her. We know that this is not her hands. We know she's not, self-stimulating and standing there and, making hand shapes in front of her face. We know it's someone else. We also know that it's from another time, right? But there's something of the agent in there. His hand, or her hand, I'm assuming it's a girl, her hand is in there, right? So we found that pretty interesting, and we found that to be the case. And that's part of what I had talked about before with just the spatial stuff and classifiers making up a large part of the agentive presence. Okay, here's another one. Again, we can't control what they talk about. This one is a young woman telling a story about a family reunion, and her father had a bunch of meat set up on a bench, and he was chopping up the meat, getting ready to throw it on the grill, when a mouse started scurrying down the chimney in front of the grill. And so he goes on to say that he saw the mouse, and so he cleavered it on the chimney, and then it went splat all over the soon-to-be-eaten meat. What's interesting in this one is she does it 3 times. The first time she does an active clause, so she shows the father cleavering the meat, and then she shows him cleavering the mouse on the chimney, but then she takes the perspective of the mouse's head, and so there's body partitioning. She becomes the mouse, and she takes the perspective of the mouse's head and signs this, and then she goes back to signing chop on the chimney again. So she has an active and then a passive and then an active clause again. Okay? So watch her sign this, and I'm sorry, it's right before lunch. So he's chopping, and then he sees the mouse, and he cleavers it, and then cleaver, and then splat. Okay? So in the middle of that, she has taken the perspective of the mouse getting cleavered, right? And she is body partitioning, so she's still the signer. She has the knife on the one hand, she has the mouse's head and neck represented with her own head and neck, and all of that is happening simultaneously in discourse. Easy language to analyze, huh? Hui. Okay. So as I said, we were interested in that notion of deployability, in when the agent was mentioned, if it was mentioned in that clause, if it was mentioned in another clause, if it was ever mentioned, or if it was only, as in the case of the woman being signed to, some part of the agent. And we found that in our data set so far, 11 of the agents had been mentioned in a prior clause. 9 of them were mentioned in that one clause, and then there's one that we have marked as unclear because we're not really sure. And that one's going to keep coming up. We have one sentence that's just not cooperating in any way. We also discovered that in our passive clauses, we looked at identified and unidentified agents, whether or not we knew who it was doing it or if it was just a part of the agent doing it. And we found that the 2 features were identical for the same clauses. So if they were identified and individuated, that was 9 out of 21 of them, but then unidentified and non-individuated was 12 of our clauses. So we did not know. And then in the active clauses, 94 of them, 94%, 47 of them were individuated, and we knew who they were, identified and individuated. So pretty well flipped. We also, remember back, we had hypothesized that the patient would be looking at the agent who was doing the action in our original study, and we found that actually only 9 of the times was the eye gaze to the agent, or the position where the agent would have been in space, and 11 times the eye gaze was to the person they were talking to. So not to the person doing the action on them, but the person they were talking to. And then 1 time it was to a neutral space, neither the agent nor the addressee, and then that same one where it was unclear. Also we asked if the agent is overtly marked, if it's a noun phrase or if it's a pronoun, if we know who the agent is it more likely to be redeployed in the next set of discourse? And we found that if the first mention is in that patient perspective clause, there were 9 of those, only 3 were redeployed in any way, shape, or form. And when they were redeployed with a full noun phrase naming what they were in that previous sort of cataphoric naming what they were. Okay? So
Is that consistent with normal and after resolution in sign language?
yeah.
I don't know about sign language.
Again, being a spatial language realized in 3D space, very often it's just a point.
That's an after resolution.
Yes, and then if it's something that needs to be named, it will be named. If it doesn't need to be named, if it's in context, pragmatically available, then it's not named very often. And very often there's not even a point like we've seen with these, it's just a movement from a locus. And we can talk about that. I'm about done and we can talk about that at the end as well. Okay, so if the agent is overtly marked in the discourse, it's more likely to be redeployed following the patient perspective clause. So if it's been marked, it's going to get mentioned again. If the first mention is in a previous clause, in this case there were 11, 7 of them were then redeployed, and an additional 1 reappeared as a full noun phrase. And then again we had that 1 unclear case. We had 28 out of 80 that were overtly marked in the clause as full NPs or pronouns for the active clauses again. So in contrast to the passive clauses, the active clauses were very often overtly marked, relatively speaking. And we had a couple of non-marked ones as well. In the active clauses, again, we had unspecified but assumed and individuated 5 out of 22, where it was not specified, but we knew who it was just from discourse. We knew exactly who it was. And then 3 that were non-specified and non-individuated, sort of generic noun entities. Okay, so the conclusions that we've reached so far based on the data that we're looking at is, regardless of the form it takes, there's always some agentive presence. So where in English you can get rid of the agent altogether in certain contexts in a passive, in American Sign Language, regardless of the form it takes, there's always some agentive presence through some sort of body partitioning or through a classifier or something along those lines. And then revisiting some of our earlier hypotheses, we found that yes, the agent is defocused, but its presence is variable, again, compared with active clauses, and that the deployability of that agent is also variable, but that the entity is less deployable if the first mention of it is in that clause. We also discovered that not following what we thought it would happen, eye gaze is not always directed toward the agent, but often elsewhere. And we hypothesized that perhaps when it's not looking at the agent, it might be indicating some sort of lack of involvement on the part of the patient. We also have concluded that semantic information in agent locus space is also variable, but often the agent has been deployed in a previous clause, and that gives us that information. And that there's a clear distinction between the agentive features in active and passive clauses. That's what we're very much finding out. And what's next is looking at the rest of that data and taking a very good look at statistical significance. We have a lot of anecdotal information for American Sign Language and other sign languages, and we all believe, especially at UNM, that now's the time to start building databases and doing more corpus linguistics. And I think that's it. That's it. Thanks. Thank you, ladies. Do they want to go to lunch? Okay, she has a question.
I'm confused primarily because I don't understand American Sign Language, but is there a specific difference in like the sign for receive and give other than just the direction? I mean, because I receive something as active, and I'm the agent in verbal language. So I don't, it's not clear to me how these definitions
Right.
are.
Give and receive. Okay, this is always a challenging thing because that's using sort of an English word.
Yeah, it's really difficult to translate.
Right, to translate it. We have a give and a give, but we also have a receive, and that is very much from the patient's perspective. Okay, and what's interesting is if I'm going to say that Sherman received something, it's kind of a weird physical thing to have Sherman receive something in Sherman space. Do you know what I mean? But to answer your question specifically, I don't know. Because again, it's hard with English translations of is it I was given or is it I received?
So is there a difference between the way you would sign I received and I was given?
Give, I was given, received. But again, this is based on my translation of those two concepts.
Yeah. It's really difficult for me to
Yeah.
interpret.
Also maybe linking a little bit to Sherman's talk, we were talking about cognitive iconicity and that signs are realized in phonological and semantic space. And we tend as speakers of spoken languages to ignore the phonological space and think of it as not conceptual in nature. Right? So one of Sherman's interesting points is how phonological space has a conceptual element.
Right.
All right. And so I want to ask you about your decision that the agent is always present and ask you, kind of push you on that. To what extent is that conclusion based on phonological characteristics of transitive verbs in ASL? Are there any transitive verbs in ASL that don't represent some physical aspect of the agent?
Right.
And the only one I can think of off the top of my head is love.
Yeah.
So if you had a love me kind of,
Yeah.
and there's no directionality then.
Right.
So do you lose?
And it's much less transitivity
Right.
on the transitive scale.
Right.
Yeah.
So are there any high transitivity verbs that don't that have movement but have no are not phonologically positioned in space?
Starting on the agent in some way.
Some way related to you.
We haven't found any.
So how would you say, it's the end of my life, and I'm happy because I was loved? How would you say I was loved?
Again, I'm not a native signer, but I probably wouldn't phrase it that way at all.
That's true.
Right?
You
Right.
wouldn't have to translate it directly.
Right. I might say something like, my life was rich and I experienced love. It could be any number of things. I don't know. And that's my thing with love. I'm not convinced it's even a verb. So we're all, we're all grappling with what are nouns and verbs in ASL.
So what about my wife loves me? You might say that.
Just that pretty clear form, not really modified at all.
How would you sign the subject in agent?
Yeah, my wife, and then probably index her, but again, I'm not a native signer.
You can say it even verbally. My wife has love for me is the
Right.
same as my wife loves me.
Right.
So you can say it without making it a verb in English.
No, that's right, of course. I was just trying to
I've
say
experienced love isn't particularly verby either. Sherman, you have a thought? I can see it.
Yeah, well, I of course, and but I do have fun. You just presented this. We were just in Poland at a cognitive linguistics conference, and we presented this. And in Poland, I was skeptical about the mouse example, and I'm much less skeptical now. But I still want to have. Look, you frame this all in terms of agent. But we do have to bring in a notion of subject, right? In the real world, we know that in something like the man chopped off the mouse's head with a knife.
Right.
We know that whole action chain exists in the real world. There's an agent there, there's a patient there, and there's an instrument there too, the knife.
And a verb there,
and a verb there. Yeah, we know that that's all there, but we can code that in different ways in language, right? And we can leave off different things. We can leave off the agent.
We can choose what to construe, what to profile,
Yes, we can.
all of those things.
And we can code, as a matter of fact, in English anyway, we can code that as the knife chopped off the mouse's head.
Mm-hmm.
That's an active sentence.
It is.
Right? Where the instrument now has become not the agent,
Right.
it's become the subject, right? And that's an active sentence. Why is that sentence in your example? That looks very active to me.
That's interesting, because in my head, that
Why is
looks
that- yeah, why
very
is that
much like
not-
the mouse got his head cut off.
I know, but why is that not you said he cleavered it.
Yeah, he cleavered it.
Well, why is that not
Active.
not he cleavered it, but why is that not the knife chopped the mouse's head off?
And what we would say, okay, of course, we're going to say that it's all on a continuum,
Yeah.
less prototypically passive because of so much mention of the father and of the cleaver, whatever it was. Is that the right word? I don't even know. But we're going to suggest that because that particular clause is being viewed from the patient's perspective, and because of the body partitioning, and because of her actually becoming the mouse and receiving the action. And in that one, the only part of the agent is the instrument, which is kind of weird.
The agent's not there at all. I accept that the
Yeah,
agent's not
okay,
there
see,
at all.
I would say the
English
agent's
sentence, the knife chopped off the mouse's head. The agent is not there.
Right, the instrument is
We
there.
assumed that there was an agent actually holding it. The knife didn't just leap up and there
We
was
hope.
actually an agent.
Unless it's a Disney horror movie.
Yeah.
Unless it's the Sorcerer's Apprentice or
Yeah.
something. There was an agent there, but it's not at all mentioned. You don't need an agent to make a
To
sentence
make the
active.
sentence active. Absolutely.
The instrument can be the
Absolutely.
subject and make it an active sentence.
So, but I'm buying this in terms of what Barb is saying we have to have, there's a continuum, more active and less active, just like there is in terms of, for example, more and less transitive
Right.
in other papers.
Things like love.
Yeah.
And then we've also been grappling, and you know this, in cognitive sign language linguistics, we've been grappling with the notion of subject and what do we do with subject in a sign language.
Well, but then I want to ask you, if there is and I accept that too, that sounds good to me, that there's a continuum. For me, the whole world is continuums too. But in English, then, is the man cut the mouse's head off and the knife cut the mouse's head off?
I would say that the knife cut the mouse's head off.
The second one is less
active. I would say it's less active.
Really?
Unless it's a magical knife.
I don't think I've ever seen that. See, that's odd. I think that's semantic. It doesn't seem syntactically less active in any way.
It doesn't seem like a less active.
Let's go to lunch and take this offline.
It seems to be the animus of the speak.
What's the safety status?
I want to give everybody an hour just because there's so many great restaurants just in the immediate area. I know that pushes us about 45 minutes behind. But if everyone could be back by